All right, rejoining the channel is our good friend TJ Cooney. And if TJ's on, that means the topic is space. So TJ, a couple of days ago, the Chinese broke a important record. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the Chinese had a 9 hour and change EVA, spacewalk outside of their space station. And yeah, it's an absolutely amazing feat, both technically and on both on the technical side, but on the human side, because spacewalks are exhausting, both mentally and physically, for any astronaut who's doing them. And because essentially you're fighting the suit the entire time. You're within a bubble, so to speak, and every time you move in any direction, you're fighting to make that movement so that the atmosphere inside your suit is maintained. So 9 hours is a lot of work. I'm sure there was no public official statement on this, but I'm sure that wasn't planned. Quite often, EVAs are scheduled to be for 5 hours, with obviously bonus time in the event that things happen that are unexpected. I know that the taikonauts, as they call them, were working on shielding outside the station for space debris, things that can hit the station and cause all kinds of problems.
So that reminds me of that Sandra Bullock movie. What was that? Was that Gravity? What was the name of that movie?
Yeah, Gravity's a really exciting movie. If you ignore a lot of the physics of it, but what it does demonstrate really well is something that is mainly theory at this point, and we hope it stays theory, which is a concept called Kessler syndrome, which is when two objects in space hit each other and they make, thousands of pieces of debris going in every which direction, and then those pieces of debris hit other objects in space and satellites, and then things just keep breaking until your sky is filled with so many little fragments of debris that you can no longer fly in space until that debris, or fly safely at least until that debris is eventually deorbited by Earth's gravity. But yeah, what the taikonauts were attempting to do is to add shielding, so if something was to hit the station, it would be protected. But it's also kind of like, at that point, when you're looking at 9 hours, it's kind of like saying, "Hey, I can drive 7 hours across the country," and then somebody else says, "Well, I can drive 8." It was like, well, cool. Both are really hard, and require a lot of the same skills. It's just a bit of a timing thing. So, from what I understand, the Chinese were not aiming to break the record, but they did.
So how much did they break because it was an American record that
Hmm.
was set like a long time ago, like 2000, 2001. But how much did they
Correct.
break it by?
They broke it by 12 minutes. So yeah, which is, well, when you're looking at a 9 hour EVA, like, that's pretty small potatoes, and could just have been the amount of time for them to climb into the airlock. So, but it is still a record nonetheless.
No, that is impressive, and props to the Chinese space program. I had forgotten that they had their own space station.
Yeah.
So what's the history of that, and how does it compare to the International Space Station?
Yeah, so they call their station the Tiangong station. It's about a little bit larger than a third the size of the International Space Station, and it's been crewed continuously for over a year now by Chinese taikonauts, three at a time. They fly up on a spacecraft that's similar to the Russian Soyuz. It's actually based on the design of the Russian Soyuz crew and cargo space vehicle. It's a little bit bigger, but when you're looking at the overall design, it's largely a copy. They licensed all kinds of documentation from Russia when it came to spacesuits, modules, spacecraft, to help them kind of get up to speed and leverage Russia's many decades of human spaceflight. Their goals are largely, from what we understand, similar to what the International Space Station is. It's to better understand how the human body reacts and operates under long duration spaceflight, to get better at their technical procedures and having people live in space. And that's the coordination of working with the agency on the ground, and also just getting that experience that they have been lacking for many decades, because they do have aspirations to go to the moon and to Mars, much like the United States and NASA and all their partners. So there are plans in the near future for China to expand their space station and add more modules. Currently, if you look at it, it looks kind of like a T, and they're going to add a whole other vertical to it, so it's going to look more like an X if you just kind of looking at it with the eyeball. And they're also developing reusable vehicles, similar to the space shuttle and soon to be Sierra Nevada Dream Chaser for the Americans. That's going to be our reusable cargo and potentially crew shuttle. The Chinese are working on something similar because they're seeing, from a cost perspective, the one and done vehicles, the costs add up.
In terms of the relative orbit of each one of the space stations, how do they orient in space from each other?
They're similar altitudes, but they're on different orbital inclinations. So they're essentially orbiting the Earth in different directions, let's say. And that's significant because that dictates where a rocket needs to fly from in order to get to that station, get to that object in space. And they chose an inclination that would not allow for Russia in particular to use their Soyuz to get to the station. The Americans, we could if we wanted to, but due to Russia's geographic location, they cannot fly in the direction to get to the Chinese space station. So what that essentially did was for all of their allies, if they want to send cargo or other vehicles to that station, it has to go through China. So they've done that for whatever the reasons were. Those obviously statements were not made public, but nobody knew what that inclination was going to be up until launch day. Because the big question was, are they going to pick an inclination that is going to allow one of their biggest partners, Russia, to also dock with the station? And they chose not to.
So when we say altitude, about how high are these space stations above the Earth?
So these space stations vary in orbit just depending on when they were most recently boosted. But typically they orbit between 211 and like 280 miles above the Earth, each of them going about 17,200 miles per hour, roughly. There's this kind of sweet spot with orbital mechanics. Depending on your altitude, you need to go orbital velocity so that you're not going too slow, that the Earth doesn't pull you back in at a fast rate, and you're not going too fast that you leave Earth's orbit. So there is this sweet spot with orbital mechanics that you can't go too fast and too slow. So those stations are orbiting at roughly the same altitude and speed, but they're going in different directions. Currently, the Northrop Grumman Cygnus vehicle is the primary vehicle used for space station boosts. The Russian Soyuz can do it as well. So they'll go and they'll dock with the station, and then depending on the timing of the orbit, they'll do a burn to increase the apogee and then the perigee of the orbit of the space station, which keeps it in orbit. If you were just to leave these objects in space, they will eventually deorbit. There is a very, 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 very thin atmosphere up there, like 0.001% of what we have here. And that does introduce a little bit of drag. And when that's measured over many years, that will eventually pull the station down. But the station can orient itself using gyroscopes, which it's doing constantly. They always want the station facing a very particular orientation so it can have optimal placement for the solar arrays and also Earth observation and their experiments that are going on. And there's plans right now to build a deorbit vehicle for the station for its eventual demise around the early 2030s. Where it needs to be tactically deorbited so that it burns up likely over the Indian Ocean. Because if we were to leave it to deorbit on its own and slowly decay, that's very risky and random, and it could burn up over a major city, which is not great.
So how often do we have to do these burns to make sure it stays in orbit?
It varies every couple months, and they're pretty brief too. So they're not like some mega huge jump. And on rare events, the station does have to be moved to avoid debris. That's another thing. We're tracking all this debris in orbit, either debris or satellites. And it's if an object comes within a few miles of the station, NASA and Roscosmos want the station moved just in the off chance that it can clip the station. So on rare occasions, it does get moved to avoid objects.
So we have a new administration coming in, and that means new appointed officials, including a new NASA administrator. What do we know about this guy, and what do we think his initiatives are going to be early in this new presidency?
Jared Isaacman is one of these ambitious tech founders has had a ton of success with this company Shift 4. If you wonder what Shift 4 means, just look on your keyboard. If you press Shift and press the 4 button, you get a dollar sign. It's basically a credit card transaction management finance company. I don't know necessarily the details, but you go to your local convenience store, you might see a Shift 4 credit card machine there. Jared is an avid pilot. I'm not sure if he was the founder, but he did own Draken for a period. So he was a defense contractor flying, his MiGs and a variety of retired naval and Air Force aircraft. And he's made quite a name for himself in that space and a lot of respect because he has flown very high performance aircraft and pushed them to their limits. He's most famous, though, for purchasing space flights via SpaceX. He's flown to space twice as a commander on Dragon and was the first person to do a private spacewalk. So he was the test pilot, so to speak, on that mission to go and do an EVA outside of Dragon. And also what was significant about that flight, too, was it was the highest orbit humans have gone to since Apollo 17. So they went further away from the Earth than we've gone to in over 50 years, which is a pretty cool thing to say. So Jared has deep history with NASA and SpaceX, and also through his Polaris program, they purchased 4 flights from SpaceX, 3 on Dragon, and 1 on SpaceX's Starship vehicle. The relationship now that he will be the administrator and he is one of the biggest clients for SpaceX does provide potentially some conflict of interest. Jared has said that his flights on the Polaris program with SpaceX may need to be postponed until after his term is up as NASA administrator, so he can focus on that work. Because flying on those flights requires a lot of training. He'll go away with his crew for a year and build that team and build the skill set so that they can accomplish that mission, and that's tough to do as an administrator simultaneously. But Jared is going to focus. There's a lot of assumptions, but he's not necessarily a fan of the Space Launch System. It's currently NASA's super heavy lift vehicle that was built to send astronauts to the moon. As a rocket, it's great. As a program and cost perspective, it's less than great. It's very expensive and has a low flight rate. And Jared wants to really push the industry forward into more commercial opportunities, so it saves NASA money to go spend that money on other ambitious projects rather than on boosters. So he's going to be looking to make some changes, and obviously he's a very close friend and colleague of Elon Musk. So, we've seen the things that Elon stands for in aerospace, and wouldn't be surprising to see some of that influence rubbing off on him as the administrator.
Well, I know critics want to dismiss him as just another billionaire buddy of Donald Trump, but as you've outlined here, he's got some pretty impressive cred in terms of spaceflight. And to underscore that, we have a brewing space race percolating. And I know that the Chinese have an ambitious desire that they're backing up with programmatics to walk on the moon in the near future. So how are we tracking with getting back to the moon?
If we were to stay the course of the plan that was set up several years ago, boots back on the moon looks like it'll be happening around mid-2027, utilizing the Space Launch System as the human booster, and then the Orion spacecraft on top of the SLS to send the crew to the moon. And that vehicle will rendezvous with a SpaceX Starship vehicle, which will take them down to the surface. And that looks like the goal is still mid-2027 for that, with next year being a crewed launch around the moon. Next year, 2026, being the crewed launch around the moon, in orbit around the moon for a test flight. So that's what we're looking at, mid-2027. And the Chinese they're on pace to be around 2030. So we are still pacing to beat them. But they are continuing to invest a lot of money into their space program. And they have surprised us several times over the years with what they've been able to do on a first go. So who's to say that they won't go faster? And the way that the Space Launch System program has been going in terms of pacing, and also the Orion spacecraft has had a recent heat shield issue that has been NASA has figured out and come up with plans with Lockheed Martin to address. Who's to say that our schedule doesn't get pushed back further? So there's the situation where we might keep getting pushed back, and the Chinese potentially can get pushed up sooner. So it might be a closer race than some think. But I'm personally confident that we'll beat them by several years. But who's to say?
Because we have astronauts identified, and what you said, Lockheed Martin, what contractors, what defense companies are behind supporting NASA with what we need to get to the moon currently. And as you hinted, we've had some delays. If X equals Boeing, they've had some bad publicity on all fronts lately. So how are we tracking with respect to what we thought we'd be doing to get back to the moon?
If you were talking to us 10 years ago, we would have had our crewed orbit around the moon at this point, and it would have been maybe even next year for our first crewed landing. Boeing is the prime contractor for the Space Launch System. There's a variety of other subcontractors who are defense contractors under that program, but Boeing has taken the lead on that. And the rocket itself functions fine. It's flown once. It's built off of the Space Shuttle heritage, but it's using Space Shuttle engines, the solid rocket boosters, and the core stage is the one thing that looks similar to the shuttle external tank, but it's wildly different in structure and design, and there's no real comparison there. But there is a lot of shared infrastructure between the two programs. Northrop Grumman is the prime contractor for the Orion spacecraft, which is the capsule that sits on the very top that the crew goes in. And the European Space Agency is one of our other partners, and they're in charge of the service module for the Orion spacecraft.
Who are the astronauts who are currently assigned to that program?
So big picture, the NASA did initially pre-select a group of astronauts who would be flying on the Artemis missions, but from all outward appearances, that pre-selection is no longer valid. But on Artemis 1, no astronauts flew on that flight. It was an uncrewed test flight around the moon. It was more of a checkout flight to make sure basic functionality of the systems were working, so that on the second flight, Artemis 2, things will be validated, and now the crew can then validate the systems even further. The mission is going to be commanded by Reed Wiseman, who is a seasoned NASA astronaut. It'll be piloted by Victor Glover, who has flown to the space station. Christina Koch is going to be flying as the mission specialist. She's also a seasoned NASA astronaut, has flown at least 6 months on station. Finally, there's Canadian astronaut flying, Jeremy Hansen. So he speaks to the international partnerships that NASA is building out for the Artemis program. It appears that we'll have at least one international astronaut on these flights moving ahead from the European Space Agency, Canada, Japan, etc., countries who have invested large sums of money into the Artemis program to help development, and they're also going to be providing their own science and technology as well. So it's an exciting thing to see with Artemis 2. And Artemis 3 astronauts, which is going to be the first landing back since Apollo 17, that crew has not been announced yet, and crews are typically announced a year prior to flight. We're not anticipating that crew being announced until the Artemis 2 crew comes home.
So you mentioned the potential conflicts of interest with both Elon and the new administrator. Assuming those get worked out, what's your overall feelings about the health of NASA and how far we're going to get in space in the coming years?
NASA is generally fairly healthy. They did not get the budget they were hoping for next year, but so they've had to pull back some staff, namely at JPL, primarily for the Mars sample return mission. But NASA's in a good place. NASA's really set themselves up to be protected by diversifying the opportunities for crewed vehicles to space, diversify the landers for the moon, SpaceX's Starship and Blue Origin's Blue Moon lander. So NASA is in an exciting place. There is certainly, people can argue, some fat to trim, so to speak, with some of these contracts, the cost plus contracts that NASA is currently working with. We see Jared really leaning into the commercial sector and trying to leverage private investment and public investment in developing these technologies, so NASA continues to be more of a customer rather than a launch provider, which is the best way for NASA to scale so that they can really focus on being on that cutting edge and helping investing in the railroad, so to speak, but not being the operator of the railroad. So there are several private space stations coming online over the next few years. Vast's space station is launching next year, which will have astronauts periodically visiting it. It's a single module space station, but they have plans for larger ones. And it's just kind of a taste of what's to come for NASA, where they're going to be sending astronauts to several destinations in low Earth orbit, lunar orbit, and on the lunar surface. So we're coming up over the next 10 years in a really exciting era for NASA and for the United States.
Well, I think we're postured for innovation and some, unprecedented momentum that we haven't enjoyed in recent years. So it'll be interesting to watch and see what happens in the near future. So TJ, always great to have you on the channel. We'll remind folks that you are the host of the I Need More Space YouTube channel, which is currently kind of on hiatus. You're going to launch it again in about a month, you say?
Yep.
Okay, so we'll look for you there, and we'll have you back on at the launch and talk about something else that's going on in space. And also, folks can find your stuff on X. That's where you're mostly active now with all kinds of space updates and other sorts of observations. So check TJ out there. So TJ, thanks again for coming on the channel, and I hope I see you in real life before too long.
Awesome, Ward. Thank you so much, and thanks for covering these important topics.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.